And it was there that I was introduced to the Power Team. The Power Team are a group of American bodybuilders who will come and do evangelism in the life of your church. These are muscle men who will tear phone books in half and then preach the gospel. I was thrilled to discover that the Power Team, at least for the purposes of this illustration, I was thrilled to find that they still exist. They are now known online as the Power Team 2.0, but the publicity is still the same. They are, I quote, a group of world-class athletes who have performed the world's greatest exhibitions of power, strength, speed, inspiration and motivation, as seen on America's Got Talent, no less. Our team, we're told, will put on an exciting and relevant show full of incredible feats of strength and an inspiring message from the Lord. What you could have had on your weekend away. What is it, do you think, that accounts for the longevity of the Power Team, who since 1998 and before have been doing these things, and churches have been booking them? The basic idea, I take it, is that the world will take notice and the gospel will be powerful if those who are delivering it are impressive. That we are worth listening to if we are entertaining enough, strong enough, funny enough, attractive enough. That the power of God is best displayed by those who look powerful themselves. And that is a thought that is sown not just as we think about our evangelism, but right through the Christian life. That God's power is best displayed by those who look powerful themselves. Each of us think that in all sorts of ways. It's the pressure to look as if we have all got it together. Maybe you feel that pressure as you come to church each Sunday to think, gosh, everyone else here seems to have it together, to be utterly competent, to look organised, their kids are well behaved. Everything about them seems so sorted. Maybe you feel the pressure as actually as you come to God in prayer and you think to yourself that God might well be thinking, them again. That he's some sort of disappointed father thinking that he's done all this for you and he has put out all of this power for you and you are still a bit of a disappointment. Why can't you be more like your brothers and sisters? Some of us as we come to God may feel that very deeply, and those thoughts will bubble around our heads. And it will mean that it feels very painful when we are aware of our weakness, to let other people see how weak we are, to speak about those things to God. And maybe on a weekend like this, that's been brought home to you. It easily happens. You're kind of suddenly in close quarters with your church family, and you've got to keep it up. Not just for a couple of hours on a Sunday, but for a whole weekend. And maybe the kids have been a bit less well behaved than you hoped, and your voice has been raised, and other people might have heard. Maybe you've found yourself exposed in some other way, and your weakness and the fact that you haven't got it all together and you're not quite as amazing a Christian as other people might have thought has been brought home. And maybe our theme for this weekend has actually made all of that just a little bit worse. That God is this great God of power, and he has put all of this power at our disposal, and still we feel so weak. And so in this last session, we need to think about God's power and God's power at work in our weakness to know what to make of these things. What we are going to see is that God has intentionally hidden his power in what looks like weakness. We are not in this last session going to take back anything that we have said so far about how awesomely powerful God is. God has powerfully worked our salvation in the death of Jesus, but he has done it in a way that doesn't look at all like power. And when we understand that, when we understand why would God demonstrate his power in a crucified king, then it will transform how we see the world, and it will transform how we want to be seen, how sensitive we are to our own sense of weakness in the Christian life. So first of all, with Paul in 1 Corinthians, we're going to see God's power hidden in weakness. Verse 18, "For the word of the cross is folly to those who are perishing." Why is it folly? Why does the word of the cross not seem to have power for people? Well, maybe the best answer is there in verse 23. What are we doing as we hold out the word of the cross? Well, in verse 23, we are preaching Christ crucified. It's a phrase that we're so familiar with, we don't quite hear the shock of it. And we're familiar with the idea of the crucifixion, and we think it is a wonderful thing, and we don't hear how ridiculous it would sound to speak of an anointed king, the Christ, crucified. Tom Wright, I think, has quite a good stab at saying what this good news amounts to. The Christian good news is about God dying on a rubbish heap at the wrong end of the empire. God dying on a rubbish heap at the wrong end of the empire. And we somehow think that is good news. It makes no sense to anyone else, though. To the Jews, the Messiah is the conquering king, the one who is anointed, who is going to be given strength. That's what Hannah's song says. He will give strength to his anointed. If he's covered in blood, that's okay, so long as it's the blood of his enemies, the great victorious one. But a Messiah covered in his own blood and naked and beaten with flesh hanging off. How is that a Messiah? And for the Greeks, seeking wisdom, what wisdom is there here to speak of a God who dies, a God who would call his death his victory? Christians who go about saying, good news, our God died. It makes as much sense as saying, good news, holidays are cancelled. Good news, I have cancer. It makes no sense. As far as the world can see, the cross is all about weakness and foolishness. But that is only as far as the world can see. And that's Paul's whole point, that the world can't see very far. It can't penetrate to the truth of what is really there. The world will judge by appearances. As it hears this message, it will judge by appearances and so miss what is really going on. Yes, outwardly, the cross is weakness and foolishness, but to those who are being saved, it is the power of God and the wisdom of God. The difference in those two views is what Martin Luther captured really brilliantly when he spoke about whether we are going to be theologians of the cross or theologians of glory. Carl Trueman sums up the difference really well and helps us move a bit further into 1 Corinthians. Here's what Carl Trueman says, that God achieves his intended purposes by doing the exact opposite of that which humans might expect. The supreme example of this is the cross itself. God triumphs over sin and evil by allowing sin and evil to triumph apparently over him. His real strength is demonstrated through apparent weakness. This was the way a theologian of the cross thought about God. The theologian of the cross is taught by the cross to say, this is power, this is where God's power is real, but it is hidden in weakness. And so we don't judge by appearances. But the opposite of that, Martin Luther would say, was to be a theologian of glory. In simple terms, the theologian of glory assumed that there was a basic continuity between the way the world is and the way God is. If strength is demonstrated through raw power on earth, then God's strength must be the same, only extended to infinity. To such a theologian, the cross is simply foolishness, a piece of nonsense. One other way to put it would be to say that the theologian of glory judges by appearances. The theologian of the cross sees things as they really are. The theologian of glory thinks, well, we know what strength looks like. It looks like the power team. It looks like tearing it up. It looks like bench pressing more than any human being should be able to. And so we know how to identify power, thank you very much. And when we look at the cross, we know it's not that. Are you going to be a theologian of glory who judges by the outward appearance and to whom the cross looks weak and foolish? Or are you going to see things as they really are, to be a theologian of the cross and to realize that God hides his power in weakness, but power it is? I think it is right to say that God has always acted in this way, that he has always wanted to hide his power in weakness. It's something that I've been chewing over as I've been working on these talks, because quite a lot of people, I think, would say that there is a real change when you get to the New Testament. That in the Old Testament, God is about great works of outward power. He is the lion. And then when you come to the New Testament, things change, and he becomes the lamb. That suddenly now God is working through weakness. But it seems to me the Old Testament is teaching us to get ready for this. The Old Testament will show us in all kinds of ways how God hides his power in weakness. Think about the Exodus once more. It is this great work of power, but what is God's answer when he hears the cries of his people in Egypt? His answer is to send a baby, a vulnerable baby, who is going to be cast on a river in a basket. When Moses is grown up, God is going to choose to use him, and he, as he says of himself, is someone who is slow to speech and not eloquent, a messenger who feels keenly his own weakness to go and confront the great power of Egypt. When God chooses Israel as a people for himself, he hasn't looked at the kind of top 10 ranked nations in awesomeness and picked number 1. Deuteronomy 7, verse 7, it was not because you were more in number than any other people that the Lord set his love on you and chose you, for you were the fewest of all peoples. God picks the nation you would pick last on your team. In Numbers chapter 6, the Midianites are attacking God's people, and God calls Gideon. Why Gideon? He says himself, how can I save Israel? My clan is the weakest in Manasseh, and I am the least in my family. When the Israelite army is ready and they assemble, God says, you have too many soldiers. What? What kind of strategy is that? Overwhelming force, surely, but no, we need fewer men. It's mad when you look across at the Midianites. Do you remember how they're described? The Midianites fill this valley like a crowd of locusts. This valley is swarming with Midianites. They have more camels than there is sand on the shore. And God says, no, Israel, you have too many troops. And so we will whittle it down from 32,000 men to 300. Like Gideon, David is the least of his family. He is the youngest, and it is him who goes up against Goliath and wins in the Lord's strength despite his relative weakness. Samson, that great man of strength, when does his greatest victory come? In his weakness, through his death. As we look through the Old Testament, it is the lives of Rahab and Ruth that are woven into the story and the genealogy of Israel's royal family. The story of great King David begins with Hannah's barrenness and her shame. Constantly you find God acting where you would not expect to find him, in the backwaters and corners of the world, with the least and the last. So it seems to me those stories and others are enough for the Old Testament to teach us not to judge by appearances, not to think that our criteria for where should God work and what should it look like is not to be trusted. We start to expect to meet God in hopeless places, working with very imperfect people, and taking every opportunity to teach his people that their weakness is a good thing, because he's going to work through their weakness to powerfully save them. So it is not that the lion in the New Testament becomes the lamb. Rather, and it's beautiful there in Revelation 5, isn't it? You are told that a lion is approaching, and a lion is approaching. But when he appears, he's a lamb. He is a lionish lamb. He's a lambish lion. He has all the power of a lion in the appearance of the lamb. Now why? If God does that, if we can see how right the way through the scriptures that is God's bizarre MO, that is how he rolls, why? Is he just playing some perverse game of hide and seek that he doesn't want people to see his power? Well, we're told here why. It's there in verse 19. The word of the cross is folly to those who are perishing. For verse 19, I will destroy the wisdom of the wise, and the discernment of the discerning I will thwart. But later on down there in verse 28, a similar idea. God chose what is low and despised in the world, even the things that are not, to bring to nothing the things that are, so that no human being might boast in the presence of God. God has saved us. He has consistently acted in a way that teaches us not to trust in ourselves, not to trust our judgment about what is powerful, not to judge by appearances, not to think that what matters is our outward strength or sophistication, so that we might boast in ourselves. God absolutely refuses to value the things the world values or to play by its rules, and so his power is hidden in weakness. So as we think about God's power at work in the world, it teaches us to be theologians of the cross, to expect to see God's power at work in unremarkable, surprising, almost appalling circumstances, that is where God will glorify himself and be at work. If we become theologians of the cross in that way, then it will transform for us how we see our own weakness. And that's where Paul takes the Corinthians here in 1 Corinthians 1. He takes them to consider their own example in verse 26. He says, "For consider your calling, brothers. Not many of you were wise according to worldly standards. Not many were powerful. Not many of you of noble birth. But God chose what is foolish in the world to shame the wise. God chose what is weak in the world to shame the strong. God chose what is low and despised in the world, even things that are not, to bring to nothing the things that are." Paul is putting out something pretty uncomfortable for the Corinthians, because here is a church that were desperate to be able to boast in their strength, a celebrity culture that wanted to attach themselves to the great preachers so that they could feel powerful and impressive and the sort of people who know God's blessing. The Corinthians wouldn't want to hear this, but he is trying to teach them to be theologians of the cross, to see how God has been at work in their weakness. Not because he wants to humiliate them, but because he wants them to understand how God's power is at work in the world. It's what Paul has learnt to do in his own ministry. As he thinks about preaching the gospel and what he is called to do, he speaks about how we have this treasure, this great word of power, in jars of clay, to show that the surpassing power belongs to God and not to us. God has entrusted this enormously powerful and wonderful message to us who are weak and fragile and everyday and common, so that the glory might go to him, that we might not be tempted to boast in ourselves. And it can feel disappointing. It can feel humiliating that we should be able to identify and hold on to and even make visible our weakness. And yet it is actually something deeply liberating for us. When we share our faith, we will almost always feel deeply inadequate. You know that pit of the stomach feeling when you realise there's an opportunity to share your faith with somebody or to say something about the Lord Jesus. And you know there are garbled words and sweaty palms coming, and it will feel weak. And you need to know in that moment, God is absolutely not thinking, "Oh man, this is so unprofessional. Where's the power team when I need them?" The same idea is spread across all of Paul's life because of his suffering, his experience of weakness across his life. Later in chapter 12, the thorn that he speaks of there, he speaks about how he has experienced this affliction, and for 3 times I pleaded with the Lord about this, that it should leave me. But God said, "My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore I will boast all the more gladly of my weaknesses, so that the power of Christ may rest upon me." This is vital to realise. God's agenda for our life is not to get you to some healthy, happy place where you can then go and be awesome for God. His plan is that through the weakness that you feel very keenly indeed, he will nonetheless be at work, so that what happens to God's glory. And that means that instead of thinking, "Gosh, I need to strive and accomplish some level of perfection and strength that is only going to be unattainable," instead, here and now, we can say, "Lord, you can use me. You do this. This is your thing." To take what is weak and foolish in the eyes of the world and to work powerfully through it. It's what Paul has learnt in his ministry, and he is no exception. As Paul says here, it is true of the Corinthian church, made up of those who are weak and unimpressive and seemingly foolish, and it is there that God is going to work and glorify himself. And it is there all the way along in the way that God is choosing the scoundrels and the outcasts to work through history. It is there as Jesus gathers around himself the tax collectors and sinners. This is how he's going to build his kingdom, with the likes of these. And so in our last few minutes together, I want us to reflect on what that will mean for us and for our churches, if we take this to heart, our own sense of felt weakness, and know that that is where God is going to be displaying his power, rather than thinking God's power is going to be best demonstrated by those who are themselves powerful. What will it mean for the life of our church? Firstly, it will mean that everyone is welcome. Imagine if we are theologians of glory about church, then we are going to be thinking to ourselves, we need the right kind of people. We need the people on our team who are going to be impressive. We need the gifted, we need the attractive, we need the eloquent. We need the people who've got it together and are going to be useful and aren't going to suck up all of our time with their needs. Imagine what sort of church that becomes. Imagine what it feels like to go to that church knowing that you don't have that much to offer. There are ways that we can easily give that sort of impression without really meaning to. There's a church whose strapline was highlighted a little while ago, and I think helpfully so. It said, "We are a church for students and young professionals." Front page of the website. We are for students and young professionals. Now that might be the majority of the congregation, and that might be some of the opportunities that God has given to that church, that they are in a setting where there are lots of students and young professionals. But do you see what that says? Do you see what that communicates? You're a single mum who goes online looking for a church. Well, they're not interested in me. You are an elderly widow, and you're wondering, is that a place where I might be loved and welcome? But if we are theologians of the cross, if we know that God's glory is revealed through the weakness of his people, that where we are weak, his power is going to be on display, then we are going to welcome all. Our church is going to be a welcoming place once we don't weigh up who is going to be useful here. It's the Theologian of Glory that's going on in James chapter 2, isn't it? When you have a rich man and a poor man coming into church, and immediately you judge by appearances and you think, well, he's got something to offer us. Oh, you're here too. Well, you can sit at the back. But a church that embraces God is gathering all of these people in their weakness to shame the wise and the strong, then we are going to lean into that. We are going to make sure that everyone feels welcome here. Second, when they come here, if everyone is welcome first. Second, no one has to pretend. The point of this session, if we want to boil it right down, is it's okay to not have it all together. It's okay to not be okay. And we need to make sure that our churches are places where it is okay not to be okay. There was a piece I read in the last week that talked about unsatisfactory Christians. Are unsatisfactory Christians welcome in your church? Let me put it this way. The church has to make room for the unsatisfactory Christian, the just getting by Christian, the I'm barely paying the bills Christian, the it took all I had to show up this morning Christian, the I'm doing my best, please give me a break and put a cup of coffee in my hand sort of Christian. If we take seriously being theologians of the cross, we are not outwardly going to think we have to keep it all together, and we are not going to hold other people to that. And it's just, I've not been in a church that hasn't wrestled with this, so I'm going to assume that you're not unique, that this is an issue, that in this church it feels like you have to show up and pretend that things are okay, and it's very difficult to talk about the things that you're struggling with, because everyone else here seems to be getting on okay. So how can we make a little bit more progress? Maybe it will be just for yourself being able to say, I'm not doing okay. To say to the Lord, I'm not doing okay. To remember that he is the God seated on high who cares for those who are down in the dust, who has compassion because he knows we are dust. Maybe the first step is just coming before the Lord and being able to say that. Maybe it's finding a friend who you trust and saying to them, I'm not doing okay. Feels like things are falling apart. Would you pray with me? How as a church might we try and make that a little more the culture? I guess it means, and there'll be lots more things, and this will be a great conversation just to continue on over lunch, but making sure that the profile that we set up and the ways that we describe ourselves and the lives that we present to each other aren't this ideal, aren't pretending to be something that we're not. And so when someone asks how your week has been, resist that temptation just to pick out the bits that look and sound best. The stories that remind people that you're in that great job, or you cracked that hilarious joke, or you're heading to that wonderful place on holiday. Maybe find ways to admit to one another our weakness, to tell the story that doesn't make us look great, but to say, do you know what? God really helped me in this week when I messed up in this particular way. Finding ways not to present this vision of perfection to ourselves. One of the images that most helps me in all of this is when Paul later on in 2 Corinthians 12, they want Paul to be this outwardly impressive guy, and they want him to boast in the way that lots of the celebrity preachers do. And so he goes on this ironical boast, doesn't he? Do you remember? He's boasting about all of his sufferings because he's trying to say this is a nonsense and you shouldn't think like this. And so he reels off all of his sufferings. And then he concludes in a really powerful way. If I must boast, this is 2 Corinthians 11, the end of 2 Corinthians 11. If I must boast, I will boast of the things that show my weakness. The God and Father of our Lord Jesus, he who is blessed forever, knows that I'm not lying. It's this great kind of climax, this kind of finish. I will boast in the things that show my weakness. And then one more story comes into his mind. One more story, and he says, let me leave you with this. At Damascus, the governor under King Aretas was guarding the city of Damascus in order to seize me. But I was let down in a basket through a window in the wall and escaped his hands. What's Paul's profile picture? What's the poster of the movie? It's Paul dangling, prone and helpless, halfway down a city wall. That's not the power team picture. But I love that. I love that he's not at all ashamed for people to see him as prone and vulnerable and embarrassed in that way. Finding ways. Now, obviously, he's going to extremes there to help the Corinthian church not boast in strength. But finding ways ourselves to tell the story of when we were in the basket, when we're kind of helpless and useless, and God's been good nonetheless, and he's worked through our weakness. That will help us. So when we take these things to heart, we will make everybody feel welcome. Everybody will be welcome amongst us. No one will feel that they have to pretend, because we are not trying to cast this spell of we are powerful and only that way is anyone going to take God seriously. Lastly, if we take these things to heart, we are actually going to expect to see God at work in our weakness. It can sometimes feel like when we talk about these things, where we're left is just saying, okay, great, so we're weak and a bit useless. And actually what I want to say to you is, no, when we acknowledge that, when we lean into that, when we stop trying to hide that, God goes, that's the kind of people I use. You can expect God to do wonderful and powerful things through those who are acknowledging and embracing their own weakness. God opposes the proud. If you as a church are going to try and assume in your own strength and wisdom and glory that you can do great things for God, God is going to oppose you. But he gives grace to the humble. And if you are able to recognize your weakness and embrace it, then he is going to work powerfully through you. He loves to do that. If we take this to heart, it actually leaves us with the expectation that God is going to do wonderful things. Remember, we are not saying that God has become this God of weakness. Rather, his great power is at work through those who embrace their own weakness and don't boast in themselves and instead resolve to boast in the Lord and his strength, to see his power at work. And that power is the power that took the sun and hung it in the sky. It's the great power that took our Lord Jesus and raised him from the dead. Amen.
Thanks, Dave. We've got 20 minutes or so for questions, and one question. I haven't looked at it yet, but I can see in the box there's only one. So why don't we just take a moment? Let's use maybe a couple of moments just in silence ourselves. We've heard so many wonderful things this weekend, and it would be great to sort of consolidate or think this is an idea that I've heard or a truth that's helped me that I'm going to leave with. So why don't you just a couple of minutes on your own, and then I'll break in. Maybe have a couple of minutes in pairs, and then we'll have whatever's left of that, about 15 minutes for questions. So let's just take a moment on our own. And the mic's on. So here's a couple of really good questions that are in the box, so thank you for that. Someone says, how do I know when I'm witnessing powerful things when they're truly from the Holy Spirit and not from our own desires. So how do we know if something's a Holy Spirit thing or I'm projecting my own desires onto him thing?
That's a great question. And it's one of those situations where I think for some time we probably have to live with not being quite sure. There are lots of things in life where you think, is that God's power for your work, or is something else happening there? Would it just have happened anyway, or is that evidence of something else at work in the world? And the Bible is really helpful, I think, in saying, first of all, you won't always know for sure. You're going to need, in some ways, to test and to wait and to see what comes from it. So I don't know what exactly someone had in mind, what sorts of things you might perceive. It might be, for example, someone whose ministry seems to be really powerful and effective. Is that a work of God, or is that something more sinister? Then I think the Bible will often teach us to wait, to see what fruit comes from that, to see whether that is something that is going to honour the Lord Jesus and bear good fruit in the lives of the people who are influenced there, or is it going to become more sinister? Is there something that is in fact just elevating that person and drawing attention for them and serving them? So something I think about the character of what we're saying. Is it something that is exalting the Lord Jesus, or is it exalting somebody else? Will be a helpful thing to discern. Sometimes it will take longer and to see the fruit of it, and so to be patient and to reserve judgment. Sometimes we're very quick and eager to think, is that good or bad, and quickly know. And sometimes learning to wait on the Lord will be a helpful thing. Probably as well, just something knowing ourselves in that would be helpful. Some of us are probably quite prone to cynicism. Almost certainly it's not something of God, you just made it up. Others of us are more prone to being excitable and thinking everything that we see is a work of God and chasing after them. Probably knowing ourselves a little bit and thinking, which way am I likely to lean? I'm something more cynical, and I would need to say to myself, this is a work of God, and to not to be too quick to dismiss it. You might come from a different direction.
Thanks, that's really helpful. Different angle. How do we use our power well in our job, especially when you have to criticise others, mentor, evaluate, appraise? So when you were saying the solution isn't to sort of reject all power, because actually neglecting to use power that God wants us to use is also a sinful thing. So what if we're in a position where we do have power over other people? Criticise, mentor, evaluate, appraise. How do we do that well?
Yeah, thank you. Those verses that we read from Mark 10 are going to be enormously helpful to think that our attitude is not going to be to lord it over others as the Gentiles do. And Paul there is particularly talking about, or Jesus rather, is talking particularly about relationships within the church. But the same thing holds. I can't be that on a Sunday and then go into the workplace and lord it over people and act as if those who are under me are my underlings to do my will, and so on. So I think being careful within the workplace to honour and respect particularly those who are under us and around us. I imagine a Christian in most workplaces can be really distinctive by knowing the name of the cleaner and paying attention to their life and showing care for them. Not just thinking the people around here who I'm going to spend time with and invite out for lunch are the people who are going to help me get on a bit here, but rather being a good friend and colleague to those around me, celebrating their successes, helping them do well in their tasks, and particularly giving attention to those over whom I'm given responsibility. And so mentoring, evaluating, appraising, needing to deliver criticism where that's appropriate, sure. But let people know that comes from a place where you love them and are there to serve them, rather than moving them around as pieces to further your glory and your goals. That would be something.
Thanks, David. I'm going to ask a couple myself, and then be thinking of one that you didn't put in the box if you'd like to ask. You talked a bit about, let me see if I got it right, because these are kind of complicated ideas yesterday, but really powerful ideas in terms of what our culture thinks. And you were talking about Foucault's philosophy that almost everything is a power play, and then how that's gone into the trans debate. And I think, if I got this right, people are encouraged to think, you've told me that I have to be a man, that's a power play over me. I reject that because I want to get rid of that sort of influence, and I'm going to decide for myself. Or you've told me I have to be a woman, I reject that. So our culture, sort of influenced by Foucault, thinks that being told which gender you are is a power play. And as Christians, we push back against that. How would we sort of, if we understand that's where our culture's coming from, what would be our response as a Christian?
So, yes, there was a video I almost showed you, which is a video designed for primary schools to introduce the idea of gender. And what that video does is it has a little animation of an infant who is put into a box that says male and a box that says female. And then it later says that as you grow up, you're told that these are all the sorts of things a girl is to do, and these are all the sorts of things a boy ought to do. The impression is created for you that, gosh, a lot of people are telling me what I ought to be, and the best response to that is to say, no, I get to define who I am, and that I don't have to live by all of those stereotypes about boys being into football and climbing trees, and girls are into makeup and saucepans. And it's that's what the video presents as. These are these stereotypes, and we recognise it. You walk down the toy aisle in the supermarket, and almost every toy is blue or pink. It is marketed as this is a boy's toy or this is a girl's toy. These are some of the expectations that are laid on people. And how, as Christians, we respond to that, I think is not simple, because we do need to acknowledge that there are lots of stereotypes that have really confused kids, because they are so tuned to, if I'm a girl, I should like all of these things, but I don't. And so they're made to question, am I really a girl because I don't fit all of these things? And a right Christian response sometimes would be to say, the Bible is less prescriptive about what it is to be male or female than our society. We have these very narrow definitions of what a man or a woman should look like and be into, and you are free from that. So to help them see, this is a power play. Foucault's right. A standard has been presented to you, and you are free to resist it. We need to be really careful, I think, in some of our youth work, for example, that we don't play up to that a little bit. I remember our kids sometime being on a Christian conference and being told, right, there's some entertainments now. Boys are going to go play football, girls are going to stay upstairs and do craft. And our kid thought, well, can we go play football? And I get that there's a kind of division of labour and all of that, and generally if you say these are the two options, then most boys are going to go over here and play football, and most girls might be interested in craft. But we reinforce sometimes those things that are unhelpful and can generate some of that confusion for kids. But what I was trying to say from how then we respond to Foucault is to say, not every category is simply somebody trying to control you and put you in a box and stick a label on you. That actually the human race, in creation, before the fall, are created male and female. And so one of the things that we're going to want to say to our children is that there is a givenness, that you are born male or female. It sets you free from having to prove to anybody that you are male or female, and that frees you to explore what being male or female looks like, given your personality and given the culture that you find yourself in. And that is a liberating thing, I think, for lots of our kids. Is that getting towards?
Yeah, it's really helpful. So Foucault's got some stuff right, but the thing he's missing is he doesn't have a God, and so he doesn't think there can ever be power that you can totally trust. So we've got lots of power that we're suspicious of, and in culture there's loads of that, and you show this in the media and so on. But one source of power that we can trust, and that's the difference.
That's right. And he's got a sort of doctrine of sin. There is a problem in the world, and it is everybody trying to control you. His salvation, his gospel, is then just live completely free from that, and go do whatever you want, just give into pleasure and desire, and let nothing else constrain you. And that of course, is a route to all kinds of selfish and self-destructive behaviour. And it's not that far from a sanitised version that says in your life you need to go and be you, and that above all is where you're going to find happiness and fulfilment, in just being you and defining for yourself who you are. And the story of creation is a story that says you live in a world that is created by a loving creator, and to know that you can trust him and rest in that createdness is a good for us.
Thanks, Dave. That's excellent. We've got 3 minutes left now, so we've used almost our question time. But does anyone have a question? I think, I wish I'd asked it, but now I've got it. I want to stick up a hand. Yes.
So in the first session, we said that God's power is good, and so we don't need to be afraid of it. How do we kind of hold that together with the commands that the Bible gives us to fear God? Particularly thinking about sort of Exodus 19 and 20, which we've been studying, and how God displays his power and they are scared, and that's really not sure if that's a good or a bad response.
Yeah, fantastic. It's a great question, and it's something we do need to tidy up. When I spoke about God's enormous power as our creator, meaning something that is not something that we need to be afraid of. What I mean by that is we don't need to fear that there is some sort of other agenda behind God, that he is serving himself or manipulating us. This is a God who loves his creation and is for his creation. And so in that sense, in a way that, frankly, we don't trust anyone in this world in leadership these days, that we know that there is no perfect leader to trust, and the disappointment of following those leaders is over and over again. And with God, there is no revelation in the tabloids that says he's not what you think he is, and you trusted him and you shouldn't have. In that sense, there's nothing to fear. Obviously, the Bible rightly speaks about the way that this is a God who is so awesome, that he is one who rightly evokes a sense of awe and fear and worship. And that, particularly because of our sin, is something that obviously he has used his power to overcome so that we can draw near. But thank you, it's really helpful.
Thanks. I think the children may be outside the door. Nathan, could you open the door and see? I see moving shadows. So, Chris, you might have to catch David after this. Thanks so much, David. Yes, here they are. Welcome, children. We look forward to hearing what you've been up